Welcome to my presentation on the spatial relationship of the art elements and concepts of space. Usually we think of space as one of the art elements along with color, shape, maybe principles like contrast, but really space is the thing that unifies your ideas, your use of materials, and your use of the art elements into an overall visual concept. So in this presentation, I want to expand this idea of what space is beyond simplistic ideas or simple ideas like overlapping or linear perspective, and think of space in a much bigger way to explore the various ways that contemporary artists construct and convey often differing but still unique and individual spatial systems in their work. In the process of creating artwork, artists worked to construct a physical and mental space in which their imaginations are free to work, that feel very much at home, like it's their creative home. You might also think of space in a very large way as the arena for your imagery and your thoughts and your feelings to mix and to collide and to take form. Or looking at the image on the screen, think of space as the container in which your ideas, how you use your materials, and how you use the art elements kind of come together. This is a sculpture in the Milwaukee Museum of Art. Notice that it's a suitcase painted a dull black, and inside of the suitcase we find a grate that you might find in a street, a drainage grate. So the suitcase has been opened up for us to look inside, only for us to find that the space inside refers to some other kind of deep space, dark space, and combined with the color of the suitcase might give you a slightly unsettling feeling. It's this feeling combined with the materials and how the materials are presented to us that adds up to the visual concept of this particular piece. In this presentation, I'm going to explore different concepts of space that you might consider using in your own artwork or in your own process. Along the way, I'd like you to take notes. I also recommend taking little, what I call idiot drawings, just really quick little sketches. If you see an image that somehow resonates with you, make a very simple little sketch. Do this because it helps encode in your memory not only that response you had to that artwork, but also the ideas that I'll be talking about in relationship to it. So you're encoding into your memory two different ways by taking notes and taking quick little drawings. You're encoding it into your memory both verbally and visually. The first big idea I want you to take from this presentation is that space gives form to ideas. Space gives form to ideas because, as we'll see, space conveys meaning. And therefore, your choice of space or the way that you develop your sense of space is going to affect the ideas that you can express, the concepts that you can develop. It's also going to affect the kinds of compositions that you choose. It might be that if you're working with an idea that you're passionate about, but you just can't get it to the point that you hope that you could, that your use of space might need to change. Maybe you're trying to fit your idea within a linear perspective sense of space, but your idea really needs a more abstract space, or maybe a collage space, or maybe a hybrid space. And we'll be exploring those ideas in this presentation. Typically, the kind of space that works best for you comes out with practice. It evolves as you build a body of work. But one thing that you might want to keep in the back of your head, a question, is the following. How does your choice of spatial systems, or how does your sense of space that you're using, cohere with, or support, or enhance, or elaborate your core idea, your insight, or your expressive purpose? How does it reinforce your overall concept, where you want to go with the work. The kind of space that you develop or evolve in your artistic process from building a body of work is going to result from the kinds of questions you ask. So remember, in your creative process, it's always more about questions and answers. Don't try to rush to answers or to force conclusions through. Ask really interesting, unusual, burning questions that can drive you forward. So if in this presentation space isn't the same thing as linear perspective, what do I mean by the concept or the word space? In this presentation, I'm using space in the following way. I'm using space as a system for establishing relationships and tensions across physical, conceptual, imaginative, and psychological distances. If we're talking about physical space, we would be talking about establishing relationships and tensions between here versus there, up versus down, close versus far. In the case of psychological space, it would mean establishing differences between things like isolation versus connectedness, fear versus safety, us versus them. Exploring differences in status, whether the status is socioeconomic status or differences in power. For instance, we have a long tradition of artists critiquing the art world power establishment in terms of critiquing museums or galleries as institutional spaces. When I talk about exploring conceptual relationships and tensions, this might mean looking at ways things are combined or divided, how they're added or subtracted, looking at the relationships between part and whole, between hierarchy and equivalence, between correspondence and incongruity, between meaning and meaninglessness, between definition and boundlessness. As artists, we also work in different imaginative spaces. We find different flashpoints for our imagination. Some of us find inspiration and tension and can establish relationships by working from scientific ideas, or perhaps borrowing from moral or political ideas, or in cultural content, or working with interpersonal relationships, or drawing on history. Some of us really like to explore the imaginative space between form and function. Other people like to explore the space between categories. How do we reframe ideas or reframe content by moving it from one category to another? The image that we're looking at right now, of course, is a detail of Marcel Duchamp's nude descending a staircase. Let's talk a little bit about linear perspective. So most people, when we talk about space, especially in art, might think of this kind of a diagram where we have a foreground, middle ground, and background. We have two converging lines that go off into the distance and seem to touch. While some people have visual impairments, most neurotypical eyes will see the very same thing, that these lines do seem to come together and touch. If you ask a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old to take a look at this picture, ask them, what do the railroad tracks do? When they get to the center, oh, they touch. So this is the visual information, the visual data that a neurotypical eye receives. This is what it looks like. It's interesting then that outside of the Western world, most cultures do not represent space in this way. And in fact, if we look at children's art, children tend not to represent space in this way either. They use a different concept of space. Let's take a look at some children's art. Here we have a figure with a building. Notice that there are lines at the top and the bottom, so there is a kind of a spatial up and down being conveyed here by the child, but proportion isn't of concern to the child. What is important to the child is that they convey a kind of meaning through their marks, through the space that they're using. So proportion really isn't important. The two things in this image that are really important are the building, perhaps it's an apartment, and the figure, perhaps it's the child. So no sense of proportion, just showing what is really important regardless of how big or small these things are in real life. Here we have another example of children's art. Notice it's a little bit different. No longer is the sky just at the top of the paper and the ground at the bottom of the paper, but rather we have a rudimentary horizon line. The child understands that the ground is a plane, is a surface on which things rest, and then there are things above or beyond or behind the ground. But notice we don't have any overlapping. Things are either up or down, above something or below something, or objects are to the left or to the right. And again, things are not shown in what we would call realistic proportion. Things are shown according to their importance to the child at the moment that this image was drawn. So the child is using a specific kind of space that we see not just in child art, but we also see it in cultures around the world. It's a hierarchical use of space where things are portrayed based on how important they are. So they may have a larger size if they're more important, or a smaller size if they're less important, or just put in the picture because they happen to be significant at the time. Another point here is that we don't simply go through these stages and then, say when we're 10 or 11 or 12, all of a sudden start drawing with linear perspective precision. That doesn't happen. Linear perspective is something that we learn. It's kind of a foreign language, not native to how our brain really works, that we learn to convey a sense of the world in a specific way. Along with that, it might be interesting to note that as we develop, our brains don't really put down markers of time and place so that we can remember specific spaces and specific events. It doesn't put down little neural markers of time and place until the age of 7 or so. We see a hierarchical use of space in many cultures, including in ancient Egyptian art, where the more important figures are usually higher and larger than the figures that aren't quite as important. This particular example of ancient Egyptian art, which again uses a hierarchical concept of space, is from a 5th century dynasty tomb, and it shows servants of a royal household. This has often been identified as the history's first depiction of a same-sex couple. We know the names of these two gentlemen, Kenohemtep and Nyankem. There is controversy whether or not this actually depicts a same-sex couple. On the one hand, it does stand out as a unique image of two people of the same sex being so closely associated. At the same time, the visual codes in the tomb are the same codes used in other cases for conveying ideas about mixed-sex couples or mixed-sex marriage. So while there might be some controversy, one thing to keep in mind is that if one of these pair were a woman, there wouldn't be a controversy. Our cultural bias would just assume that they were married. In fact, there is a long tradition in the West of isolating or separating Egypt from its geographical and cultural connections to Africa and trying to understand Egypt rather in terms of a narrative that spans ancient Greece and Rome and then going into Western Europe. In any event, the space that we're seeing, the space used to convey meaning, importance, significance, is a hierarchical use of space.